'cause I'm on one.
You know, we have ones that's Ras Tafari, live in the city, Kingston City, Manhattan, like you know, we live amongst our universal brothers and sisters, and Rastafari is for each and every one. So it's not a...
Swinging for the fences for the home run.
Habesha, Megusana, guess the Ethiopia. Habesha, Mrs. Maya, the Farambasa. Habesha.
Even further beyond into the universe, but I've got to make it to first.
Urgent message from the 12 seers of Mount Zion. They said the black nation will be blessed by God in these days. Circle the mountain and go home. Shabbat, Mount Zion calling me.
And keeping up with the times and our current events, which we have seen here, and 2019 certainly can mark a year of protests. But coming here from Zero Hedge from Tyler Durden, October 28, 2019, entitled, "We now have mass public unrest in France, Spain, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, Hong Kong, Venezuela, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia." Monday morning, and here we go again for another dramatic week. There are going to be monthly PMIs to look at in particular. We will see any further deterioration, or will growth start to pick up as an early Christmas present. And there are, of course, rate meetings for the Fed and the BOJ and the BOC. The former will cut, with the real issue being if they will signal more soon or not, given they are already deep in repo madness. And will the giant BOJ wake up from slumber like a giant kaiju and start throwing markets into turmoil again? Plus, there is Brexit and the Brexit circus. Will the EU grant the UK an extension until in January 2020, or a more flexible date? Or will France veto that and insist on a very short extension? Almost certainly they will insist that the newly reopened withdrawal agreement is this time firmly shut. So if the British Parliament then decides to merely reopen it from its end and unilaterally start ramming amendments into it, it will not be doing so with EU approval. As such, and just as pertinently, will Prime Minister Bojo get his December election or not? The greater likelihood is not, as Labour appears to be desperate for an election, just not now. Although the Lib Dems may be prepared to allow one, given they see this as a way to prevent any further movement towards Brexit in the short term. Though, what do they think the election campaign will be about? The price of cheese? Not that the latest opinion poll for the Observer has the Tories on 40%, Labour unchanged on 24%, and the Lib Dems on 15%, with the Brexit Party on 10%. In Europe, we have just seen the AFD surge to second place in state elections in Germany's Thuringia, with 24% of the vote, double what it got last time, putting it 1 point ahead of Chancellor Merkel's CDU, with the far-left Die Linke in first place. The AFD are nowhere near power, as nobody will cooperate with them, but that 24% outcome is all the more remarkable given an attack on a synagogue and neo-Nazi death threats through the campaign. In China, Chairman Xi Jinping will be presiding over the long-expected Communist Party plenum, which is usually looked to for policy guidance. Market expectations this time are that all the focus will be on politics and control, and none will be on market-based reforms. Tellingly, this weekend saw China disband a 3-year-old global forum on still excess capacity after nobody has been prepared to cut back on capacity. China is claiming it alone has. But this somehow overlooks that its net steel output is up on 3 years ago, at a record high and still growing. On Ukraine, or Ukrainegate, the U.S. impeachment wagon continues to trundle along, with supporters claiming it is laden with damning evidence and opponents arguing it has exactly as much weight as Russiagate did. Perhaps the apparent elimination of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi by U.S. Special Forces will tip the Washington political balance slightly back towards consensus, but perhaps not. As the Washington Post, quote-unquote, "The Truth Dies in Darkness," changes its headline description of al-Baghdadi, who presided over torture, mass murder and rape, slavery, and genocide, from quote-unquote terrorist-in-chief to quote-unquote austere religious scholar, and then finally to extremist leader. Could they not perhaps have settled on populace? He wondered sarcastically. Enough mutiny about Fed policy. Our House view remains they are going all the way back to zero. Enough mutiny about PMIs. It is obvious that broad swaths of the economy are slowing down. The global backdrop remains of slowing growth, increased financial vulnerability in places, and yet an institutional architecture that is either in denial or has no firm idea of what policy mix to use to stop this from happening. And crucially, global populations that are not content to just sit and wait for something better to turn up eventually. Indeed, consider that we now have mass public unrest on and off. In France, Spain, and that 24% AFD vote in Germany, and Brexit in the UK, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, Russia, Hong Kong, Venezuela, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia, plus deepening polarization in the US, and one could add the middle class disruption of Extinction Rebellion in Australia, Canada, and others. In short, there isn't a continent that isn't seeing unrest in some form. And as Branko Milanovic notes today, one wonders if this isn't all a little 1968-ish. Of course, one can't usually join dots that simply, but if this is 1968 Redux, then consider the historical echoes. The Prague Spring was violently crushed by Soviet tanks, and the West was powerless to prevent it. Meanwhile, student uprisings in the West produced social reforms and a policy swing to the left. Along with the Vietnam War, that contributed to the end of the USD Peg 2 goal and the first phase of the global Bretton Woods order, and then to very high inflation in the 1970s, which was ultimately ended by the Volcker Fed, and the current phase of deflationary neoliberal globalization that is once again pushing people out onto the streets. In short, regardless of what the Fed does this week, or the BOJ, or whatever the PMIs print at, and whatever the EU or Boris give and get, we still face ages and ages of rage in a market that is still largely pricing for the calm of the status quo ante. Our beta testing site is now up for your perusal. There will be products added on a daily basis, so those looking to support our platform here on Anchor FM, as well as our many other platforms, feel free to support Ras Tafari on the Brink by visiting gashanator.onuniverse.com. And so just to continue on with that report, as Zero Hedge there and the writer kind of jumped around a bit, Tyler Durden, with much of the topics. It kind of covered a lot of the things that we have been speaking about here on Discipleship Radio and other platforms as well. We mentioned so many times that, through this technological age and this age of Aquarius, this new eon, this new time, and this new time-space continuum that we happen to be heading towards, even with 2020 right at our doorstep now, we see so many changes going on, not only internally but externally, and this is, from any other perspective, in and around the world. We see governments actually considering positions that they've never considered before, and some stepping into new positions and some stepping into positions that they've never held, for quite some time, if ever. But what we happen to see is that so much of the things that we were used to seeing are now going to change again in, very significant ways, and very heartfelt ways, we would say, on one end, and on other ends, certain things would just, kind of flow into place. But having a lot of this foreknowledge and, making sure that ones adequately prepare themselves for whatever dangers might lurk, and also continuing to push forward for the things that are going good for them or to make them better. This kind of gives ones a perspective into their own worldview and gives them another worldview in that sense. And that kind of adds to, whatever knowledge ones may already be privy to, or, may be gaining on their own personal journey. But as we can see, again, as the report mentioned, protests all over the world. It's probably been a very long time since we've ever had something like that historically happen. And in this sense, the writer references the late 1960s on into the early 70s. And that, marks a lot of significant pinpoints for ones to actually research for themselves. And even so, I took many notes on that, and just assessing what we have been speaking about and studying on our own time, and seeing what, we see out here in the world on a day-to-day. Certain things start to add up, and you start to gain a bit of foresight that will allow you to look ahead if possible. So that really is, not only a gift and a present in itself, but it's something of a skill that ones can learn and develop. And we definitely look to do that ourselves as, we share this with other ones who will be listening to the sound of our voice, and hopefully they can, adjust themselves accordingly. But, again, here are very interesting, as always. The times keep on turning, as they say, and we'll keep on burning. But in this sense, we leave this report and other things that will turn up, in a sense, as far as our topics that are ongoing, and kind of keep ones updated on what we see and hear out here in the world.